I'm Senior Legal Counsel at the Justice Collaborative, and today we're going to be talking about predatory cities. Predatory cities are urban areas where public officials systematically take property from residents and transfer it to public coffers, intentionally or unintentionally violating domestic laws and basic human rights. We're joined today by Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin, former mayor of Flint, Michigan, Karen Weaver, and Professor Bernadette Atuahene, who has extensively documented predatory city practices in cities across the country, from Detroit to New Orleans to Washington, D.C. Cities like Ferguson, Missouri, for example, where police officers systematically focus on enforcing low-level traffic offenses and outstanding warrants for minor offenses in order to collect fines and fees without conducting ability to pay hearings. In New Orleans, this has meant collecting user fees for all individuals charged with crimes in order to fund the courts that prosecute them. This is also done without determining whether the individual can pay those fees. This often means that people who are incarcerated and penalized in other ways because they don't have enough money to pay these fees. In Detroit, this practice has included using unconstitutional property tax assessments to tax working class homeowners in the city's poorest areas far above the actual value of the property. The vulnerable communities targeted by these practices are an easier target to tax through these measures rather than richer residents. Predatory city practices are often driven by budget shortfalls. The global pandemic has created historic budget shortfalls for city and state governments as businesses shutter and the need for services increases. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he would rather see cities go bankrupt than have the federal government provide adequate funding to bolster municipal and state budgets. As a result, many of these governments are likely to turn to predatory practices to make up deficits. One alternative to these predatory practices would be a substantial expansion in federal aid going to cities. The first round of CARES Act funding provided some assistance to local and state governments, but more recent federal stimulus packages have not. Another solution would be to tax large corporations that call many of these struggling cities home, as some city officials and activists have called for in Seattle through the Tax the Amazon campaign and elsewhere. So let's talk about it. Mayor Bronin, as the pandemic drags out, there's a significant chance that revenues will be even lower than expected. What are you doing to make sure that your city doesn't engage in the kind of predatory revenue practices we've seen in other cities with significant budget shortfalls?
Thanks, John, and thanks so much for having me on. The city of Hartford has faced enormous fiscal challenges for a long time. When I took office about 5 years ago, we actually were on the verge of bankruptcy. The city was deeply insolvent, and it had faced huge challenges for a long time. And for a long time, the city had dealt with those challenges in ways that didn't really make it any better over the long term. Taxes kept going up year after year. The city borrowed too much, restructured debt in a way that just pushed it out to future years, future generations. And so when I came in, we faced a really acute and urgent fiscal challenge. And our pledge at the time was, we're going to deal with this in a way that doesn't keep relying on those old tools, that doesn't raise taxes, that doesn't shift the burden onto residents. And we had to do a lot of things, including asking our biggest companies to contribute a significant amount of money on top of the taxes they paid, and also asking the state of Connecticut, which is an affluent state, although we as the capital city are one of the poorest cities in the country, to step up and build a different kind of partnership. So we had to make a lot of tough decisions here, but we were also determined to do it in a way that didn't do the thing that cities like Detroit had done for year after year, which is slide toward what's called service insolvency, where they just stop delivering services to residents, the services that residents need and deserve. And we pressed that bigger conversation about shared responsibility. And I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of getting the federal government back in the game. It's not just right now in the midst of this pandemic that we need the federal government to be in the game. The federal government used to play a much bigger role when it came to funding education, funding transportation, funding so many things that they've stepped away from. So I hope that we can not only use this moment to press for the urgent assistance that's needed for cities and states across the country, but that we also use this as a moment to have that bigger conversation about an appropriate role for the federal government, so that you lessen the profound disparities that exist between some of our cities and the communities that surround them.
So you spoke a lot about, or a little bit about the tools that you've used. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically what you were able to do to not engage in some of these predatory practices?
So, early on, one of the things I will say is we had a very serious discussion of bankruptcy, not because we wanted to take the route of bankruptcy, but because I felt strongly that given how bad our fiscal situation was, I was not willing to keep going to our residents and trying to extract more resources from residents. And that if we had to do something drastic, it was going to include going to bondholders, going to creditors, going to those big financial institutions that were creditors saying, you've got to participate in this. But because we pressed that conversation and drew that line in the sand, we were able to get the state to partner in a different way. And that allowed us to get to a place of greater sustainability. But we have a ton more work to do. We had gotten on a much stronger path. And now, today, we face the immense uncertainty of the coronavirus. Coming into that this budget year, looking at the uncertainty of the pandemic, we made for example, some cuts to our police department, even prior to the murder of George Floyd and prior to the movement that followed his murder, because we wanted to make sure that we were doing everything we could to preserve the key services to our most vulnerable, like recreation and health and services for homeless. And so that's where we chose to make the cuts. But what I think as a country we've got to get to is a place where communities that are historically under-resourced, which are often communities of color. And the city that I serve is about 85% community of color, a city where more than half the kids are growing up in poverty. And like so many cities across the country, there is a profound racial and socioeconomic segregation between this city and the communities that surround us, just like is mirrored in cities and states across the country. So I think it's about having that bigger conversation so that cities like Hartford and like Flint too are not always in the position of being asked to cut one service in order to fund another, but rather saying, how do we build models that actually allow for the appropriate service delivery for the residents in those communities without either extracting the resources from the residents themselves in an unsustainable and unjust way, or without cutting services so deeply that you're defaulting on your most fundamental responsibilities as a government.
Now, look, you mentioned reducing police budgets, and I wanted to ask you, how are you able to do that in this moment, and what are the next steps, for Hartford?
Again, we've had to make tough decisions year after year. This year, I proposed a cut coming into this year's budget. Then during that budget process, working together with council, we reduced the police budget further. We took some additional money out and dedicated it to other services like health and human services, like young early learning, and a couple of other places. And we also reallocated some funding inside the police department to dedicate more resources to training, making sure that we could have more officers out of their cars, walking on the beat and building relationships rather than just doing patrol. So there was both reduction and reallocation. I want to be honest, the changes we made there did not rise to the level of some of the drastic cuts that some advocates have called for, the drastic defunding that some have called for. And we have had those voices, those abolitionist voices, and I want to acknowledge I don't agree with those voices, but we have always been willing and have been particularly willing this year to say, look, we don't want to really press hard and make sure that we are doing the least harm as possible when we've got to make cuts, and doing the best we can for our residents with the resources we've got.
Thanks, Luke. I'd like to follow up a little bit later on some of those points, but at this point, I would like to bring in Bernadette. And Bernadette, you've spoken a lot about systemic racism and how this goes beyond being just unfair. I'd like you to describe, what is a predatory city?
Right. So a predatory, well, first of all, thank you for this invitation. I'm extremely happy to be here. I bring you greetings from Detroit, where I'm currently stationed, really doing research into the property tax foreclosure crisis here in Detroit, which is one of the reasons why Detroit has become a predatory city. And so how I define a predatory city is that they're urban areas where public officials systematically take property from residents and transfer it to public coffers, intentionally or unintentionally violating domestic laws or basic human rights. So what does that look like in Detroit? Well, in Detroit, we have a situation where 1 in 4 homes has been subject to property tax foreclosure. 1 in 4. We haven't seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. So the question is, what in the world is going on in Detroit? Well, the Michigan State Constitution is quite clear. No property should be assessed at more than 50% of its market value. Usually to determine other jurisdictions say things like it has to be uniform, equal, fair. These are all nebulous standards up to a court to determine legality. But because Michigan has a ratio, no more than 50% of a property's market value, it means people like me can come in and run the numbers to determine legality. And so that's exactly what we did. And our findings are simply astonishing. We found that between 2009 and 2015, in each of those 7 years, anywhere between 55 and 85% of properties were being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. My God. And when in 2017, a lot of people know that, Detroit got taken over by an emergency manager, but what they don't know is the state also took over its assessment division because of this rampant illegality. And so what Detroit did in order to get control back of its assessment division is they did a parcel by parcel reassessment of the city. And so we redid the study after this parcel by parcel reassessment. Chris Berry from the University of Chicago redid that study, and he found that things got better, but for the lowest valued homes, things have not gotten better. And in fact, we find that when you look at, we break up the data into what we call 5 quintiles. Quintile 1 is the lowest valued homes. Quintile 5 is the highest valued homes. So almost 95% or more of homes in the lowest valued homes are being unconstitutionally assessed. But when you get to the highest valued homes, only about 15 to 18% are being overassessed. So we have the poorest amongst us who are being subjected to these unconstitutional property tax assessments. And the other point is that we did a study and we show that of these lowest valued homes that are being systematically, and almost the vast majority are being overassessed, we found that 1 in 4, we're able to say 1 in 4 of those homes would not have gone into tax foreclosure, but for these illegal property tax assessments. And I also need to make sure that we understand the racial implications of what we're talking about, because this is not just happening willy-nilly. Detroit's an 80% Black city. And so if you do research in Detroit and you're not looking at race directly, you're doing everyone a disservice. So we looked at Wayne County, which is a county in which Detroit sits in, and we're able to say that the majority African-American cities, that's Detroit, Inkster, and Highland Park, each having a population of 70% or more African-American, they are experiencing these unconstitutional tax assessments and foreclosures at a greater rate than the white cities. So I need you to understand what's happening in Detroit as it falls within this rubric of a predatory city because there's illegality happening, but the illegality is not happening equally amongst all citizens. It's happening to Black and brown people and poor people who are vulnerable and unable to fight back. And that's how it works. Whether you talk about predatory cities, again, I gave you a really rich picture of how Detroit became predatory. But it's not just Detroit. As you mentioned in your opening, John, in the paper, the study I write, I talk about Ferguson, New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and I talk about not just property tax administration, but a slew of other areas in which cities have become predatory.
Thank you, Bernadette. Now, you've spoken, and those numbers are staggering, first of all. So this idea of it being a hurricane with no water, right? Like a flood of blight. Those are some of the words you've used. You hear these narratives of blaming the poor and claiming people are buying purses instead of paying their taxes. Like, why is that not true? Like, what's really happening in a lot of these places?
Absolutely. So the real question is, we have this astonishing instance of illegality happening, an astonishing instance, again, 1 in 4 homes. Black people's homes in Detroit are being stolen illegally. And the question is why, right? And the answer to that, in my interviews with officials, the answer, no matter what official I interviewed, the kind of standard line, as you already said, John, is there's some kind of blaming the poor. Either they're saying, or like you said, you decide to buy a purse instead of paying your taxes, you bought a house that was too expensive for you, et cetera, et cetera. But what's really happening here, it's systemic. We're dealing with an honest to God instance of structural racism in Detroit. And the hard thing with individual racism, we know how to talk about that because Hollywood has trained us. We got white hats and black hats. We got good guys and bad guys. We know how to talk about that. What we don't know how to talk about is structural racism because you can't put a black hat on a system. It's hard to make a system a bad guy. And what we're dealing with in Detroit is a faulty system. It's a system that is producing racially disparate impacts. And it's about, and addressing that system is so necessary. But currently, although the data is just so clear, again, data produced by me and other scholars in this area that there's a problem, the current mayor of Detroit refuses to, again, these overassessments are still happening. He's refusing to take action. Why? Well, I don't know why. Let me be frank about I don't know why, but I do know it is a huge problem because in order to address it, he's going to have to fix a system with many different moving parts, with many, right? And there's no political will to do that fixing of a system that is wrong. But that's the work that needs to be done to take care of this instance of structural racism and all other instances that we see in America.
Absolutely. Karen, I'd like to continue this theme of talking about systems. You in Flint, Michigan, you served as mayor, where there were famously austerity measures that were implemented after devastating revenue shortfalls. What effects did these revenue problems have on the way that Flint went about doing both policing and taxation? You're muted.
Okay,
right,
now you can hear me. Thank you.
Yep.
I'm glad to be here. And I was saying, I was nodding my head when Bernadette was talking because everything you talked about that was happening in Detroit. I said, Flint was always looked at as a mini Detroit because it was the exact same thing. And as I was reading the article, I'm going, yeah, this is, these same things happened in Flint. And so, and that was how we always felt. But you were talking about some of the revenue sharing and what was going on. Well, it was taken, revenue sharing was taken. And before we had revenue sharing, when we had it, I should say, because you were talking about policing. At the height, we had probably maybe 300 to 400 police in the city. After that was taken, we're down to maybe 100. That's not enough for a city of 100,000. That's nowhere near enough. And not only did we lose policing, but as far as any of the equipment that goes along that police need to do their jobs, all of those kinds of things were taken, whether we're talking about state-of-the-art bulletproof vests, whether we were talking about what they needed for technology, whether we're talking about what they needed for cars. And it was greater than just policing. It cut across a lot of those city services that people needed to really survive. It took away things such as we didn't have garbage trucks, snow removal, water pipe was taken. All kinds of things happened as a result of that, and we have not gotten that back. If you look at what happened, I mean, we probably lost almost $55 million in revenue sharing that we would have had to be able to make some things happen in the city of Flint. It's gone now. And it was funny because we had this water crisis. Well, right before the water crisis happened, there was a show that was being filmed in Flint called Flint Town. And it was about policing in the city of Flint and what was going on. And some people said, well, did that show do you any good or did it hurt you? Well, it helped us because what happened was there were some foundations around the country that said, look at what this police department is doing with these limited resources. And that was how we were able to access resources. It was through the generosity of others from other places stepping forward to say, Flint needs these things, and we're going to come in and we're going to meet with this mayor, we're going to meet with this chief of police, and we're going to give them what they need to make things happen for them. It wasn't, the state didn't step up and do that. What was going on with our policing was, we're going to take your police officers out, and we put state police in the city of Flint instead. And state police came from other areas, especially from northern Michigan, where there are very few Black people. And so they were put into a community that they didn't know, that they didn't understand. They weren't trying to know and understand. And bad things continued to happen as far as crime and policing in the city of Flint. That's what was going on with that. But you also asked me a question about the water, and I want to make sure I address that.
Yeah, I mean, in this moment, part of it was in this moment as so many advocates are reimagining safety and reimagining policing, and in so many places where the only place where the money isn't cut is policing, right? Like we're thinking about services, critical services, public health, and all I think Flint was an example where everything is disappearing, right? And so I'd like to open it up actually and say, how can we prevent this from happening? What are the solutions? And I know cities can't do it
let me say,
alone.
One of the things we have to do is we have to challenge the system that's in place. And we can't be afraid to speak up and speak out about it. I remember even when I was going to declare the emergency, I was told, well, you're doing the wrong thing and you're only going to get, they told me, you'll only get $5 million. I said, well, that's $5 million more than what I have, but we were able to get, close to 200 million just to do the infrastructure and change the pipes. But we have to be willing to challenge the systems that are in place. We had these meetings because our water had been poisoned because $100 a day wasn't spent on corrosion control when they put profit over the public health and well-being of the people in this city. And for 18 months, we knew brown water wasn't good. So we had these meetings, and we had people all around the table representing all of these various agencies and organizations, and 15 parts per billion as far as lead, that was the accepted standard. Well, we know that shouldn't be an accepted standard. We know no lead in water is what we should be fighting for. And so we fought for that, and they went down to 12, and we were supposed to get excited. Yeah, that's better than 15, but we continue to challenge the system. They said that the regulatory agencies don't have oversight for schools and daycares. Well, they were going to leave the city without testing the water at schools. I mean, the kids and seniors were the most vulnerable population. And I said, while the school is in my purview of what I have control over, you're not going to leave this city without testing our schools and making them step up and do that. And that's, I think, a responsibility, whether, like I said, I wasn't responsible for the school system. They had their own governing board. But at some point, we have to say, this is not right. We are not going to stand for it. And we are going to challenge you. And we're going to be very vocal about it. And those are some of the things we have to do. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Karen. Luke, in thinking about these systems and the tools that we have, this moment, I mean, in some ways, it looks pretty similar to what we saw in 08, 09, plus a global pandemic, right? And so what are some of the tools you're looking at? What are some of the solutions that other cities that are similarly situated can be looking to, as opposed to trying to figure out solutions on the back of the most vulnerable people and poor people of color in particular?
Look, I don't know whether Karen and Bernadette agree with this, but I think that when we talk about the systems that are broken, and we talk about cities and under-resourced cities, underserved cities, there are a lot of things we need to be talking about. We need to talk about the policies that have resulted in the concentration of poverty. We need to talk about housing policy at both state and federal levels. And we need to be talking about exclusionary zoning that has resulted in historic levels of socioeconomic separation or segregation in communities. I think we've seen such intense pressure on so many communities, because you have this sorting where you have more affluent residents outside of certain communities, and then you have concentrations of poverty. And yet in many states, including in Connecticut, the primary sources of revenue are the local ones. It's the local property tax. It's the things that are generated locally. So you're pulling the resources from some of the poorest communities to provide services where services are needed more. And so there are some fundamental structural flaws that I think have to lead to bigger conversations about again, housing policy, transportation policy, so many things that I think can help correct some of those really deep structural challenges that are enormously broken and burden communities like Hartford and Flint too, I imagine.
Bernadette, I'd like to bring you back in. Who's doing this right? What are some cities that are at least already doing this right or starting to do this right? What's the way forward?
Well, I think it all comes down to political will is the way forward. It all comes down to political will. What do I mean by that? For instance, in Detroit, it's not an issue of oversight. We have the data. We know there's a problem that still continues. The mayor has refused to act. And so now it's up to the governor to act, to form a commission to investigate what's happening in Detroit and do something about it. We need political will. Also, we need political will from at the federal level, as Luke mentioned, at federal and state level. Cities are trying to pull from wells that are ever drier. They're trying to do more things with less money. CDBG grants have decreased by at least 80% over the last 20 years. In Michigan, the EVIP, they've systematically reduced funding to cities. And so we need political will at the federal and the state level to provide more funding to cities. And we also need more political will within the cities to reapportion funding that they already have. Part of that reapportionment looks like taking some of the money away from police, which is absolutely necessary, but also the reapportionment has to do with taking away some of these corporate tax breaks and corporate subsidies and giving it to the people. So we need political will within the city to do this reapportionment of funds that already exist. So on those three levels, what those three levels have in common, again, is political will. And we need political will to really move forward.
Thanks so much, Bernadette. On the briefing, that's what we're trying to examine is where is the political will? Like, who are the champions and the people that are fighting for ideas that are going to actually really help people? And so I appreciate each of you coming on the briefing, giving your perspective and help us think through these issues. I know you all are very busy and have to run, but I appreciate your time. And for our viewers out there, we love you, appreciate you sticking with us, and we're going to continue to explore these issues and figure out how we could both make sure you're briefed on the most important issues of the day and make sure you have some of the tools to start addressing the systemic, as each of you mentioned, the systemic challenges that we're facing and will continue to face in the future. So thank you and have a great weekend. We'll see you next month.